He leaped into a searing laser strike, shielding her, not knowing she's the hidden alien queen. Welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. In the year 3047, amidst the shadowy tendrils of an endless war that span across the stars, humanity found itself teetering on the brink of extinction. The Drai, an enigmatic alien species with iridescent scales and luminous green skin, had emerged from the farthest reaches of the galaxy, their intentions veiled in layers of cryptic diplomacy and sudden violence. Worlds burned, fleets were lost, and the tenuous alliances between humanity's fractured factions began to unravel. It was in the midst of this chaos, on a desolate, war-ravaged planet known as Zos 9, that the destinies of a battle-hardened human soldier and a mysterious Drai woman would intertwine, setting in motion a chain of events that no one could have foreseen. Gustav Algren stood amidst the scorched landscape of Zos 9, his armor caked in layers of dust and soot, the stench of burnt ozone lingering heavily in the air. The barren expanse stretched endlessly around him, the sky a sickly, sulphurous yellow, perpetually blanketed by the haze of destruction. The remnants of a brutal skirmish lay scattered at his feet, smoking craters where mortars had struck, the charred husks of combat drones, and the mangled remains of what had once been his squad. The battle had been swift and merciless, an ambush orchestrated with chilling precision by the Drai. Gustav, the sole survivor, felt the weight of his failure pressing down on him, a grim reminder of the cost of underestimating his elusive enemy. The mission had been simple enough: a reconnaissance sweep of the outer colonies, a routine patrol in what command had assured them was a relatively secure sector. But the Drai had proved once again that they were always a step ahead, their mastery of guerrilla tactics and advanced technology leaving the human forces scrambling to adapt. As the smoke from the recent firefight began to clear, Gustav's Cal unit crackled to life, a garbled transmission barely audible over the static. It was a distress signal, faint but insistent, originating from a nearby settlement that had long since been abandoned, a ghost town lost to the ravages of war. With a weary sigh, Gustav adjusted his visor, his eyes narrowing against the glare of the distant twin suns. He had no illusions about the dangers of investigating an uncharted signal alone, but he had his orders, and more than that, he had his pride. His reputation as a fearless soldier, one who never shied away from the fight, had been hard-won through countless battles and near-death encounters, and if there was even the slightest chance that survivors needed help, he couldn't in good conscience ignore it. Steeling himself, he set off across the cracked and desolate terrain, his pulse rifle at the ready, every sense on high alert for signs of movement. The settlement, when he finally reached it, was a stark and desolate ruin. The skeletal remains of buildings jutted out from the earth like the bones of some long-dead behemoth, their walls pockmarked with the scars of previous battles. Sand and ash had reclaimed much of the land, creeping into every crevice and piling up against the decaying structures. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the mournful howling of the wind that swept through the empty streets. It was a place that had known only death and despair, a graveyard of forgotten hopes and shattered dreams. As Gustav navigated the maze of rubble, his helmet sensors picked up faint heat signatures, a sign of life amidst the desolation. His heart quickened, his grip tightening on his weapon. As he approached the source, rounding a corner, he came face to face with a figure crouched amidst the debris, her form partially obscured by shadows. Her skin was a luminous shade of emerald, shimmering faintly under the harsh glare of his helmet light. A long, slender tail coiled protectively around her, and her eyes, piercing and otherworldly, met his gaze with a mix of defiance and desperation. Instinctively, Gus raised his rifle, his training kicking in as he assessed the threat. This was a Drai, unmistakably so, though she was unlike any he had encountered before. The Drai he'd fought were brutal warriors, their bodies adorned with intricate armor, their movements swift and deadly. This woman, however, appeared unarmed and vulnerable, her clothing tattered, her posture defensive, but not overtly hostile. She was injured, a deep gash running along her side, the blood that seeped from the wound a vivid shade of teal against her green skin. "Don't move," Gust commanded, his voice echoing harshly in the stillness. To his surprise, She did not flinch, her gaze steady and unyielding. There was something in her eyes, a glimmer of intelligence, a spark of something he couldn't quite place. That gave him pause before he could process the situation further. A high-pitched whine pierced the air, a sound that Gustav recognized all too well. Laser fire. The Dre were closing in, their attack imminent. Without thinking, Gustav lunged forward, his body moving on pure instinct. He positioned himself in front of the woman, shielding her as a barrage of searing laser strike rain down upon them. The air crackled with energy, the heat from the blast scorching the ground around them. Gustav felt the impact reverberate through his armor, the force of the assault nearly knocking him off his feet. He braced himself for the inevitable, for the searing pain that would signal his end, but it never came. Instead, a strange shimmering field of energy materialized around them, the laser fire deflecting harmlessly off its surface. Gustav's eyes widened in shock as he glanced back at the woman who stood with her hand outstretched, her eyes glowing with an ethereal light. The defensive barrier pulsed with power, a testament to abilities that far exceeded anything he'd ever witnessed. In that moment, Gustav realized two things. First, that he had unwittingly stumbled upon someone of great importance, and second, that his simple mission had just become infinitely more complicated. The enemy fire ceased as abruptly as it had begun. The silence that followed, thick with tension, Gust turned to the woman, his mind racing with questions. Who was she? How had she managed to defy the laws of physics with such ease? And why, amidst the devastation of a war-torn planet, had she chosen to save him? There was a story here, a secret that lay hidden beneath the surface, and Gustav knew that his survival, and perhaps the fate of humanity itself now, depended on uncovering it. Before he could speak, the woman swayed on her feet, the glow in her eyes flickering briefly before fading. The barrier dissipated, and she staggered, her strength clearly wanting. Without hesitation, Gust caught her as she fell, his grip firm yet surprisingly gentle. In that moment, as her weight settled against him, he felt a strange sense of connection, a bond that transcended their differences, hinting at a destiny far greater than either of them could have imagined, with enemies still lurking in the shadows and the mystery of her true identity looming large. Gust knew that this was only the beginning of a journey that would take them to the farthest reaches of the galaxy, testing the limits of trust, courage, and the fragile thread of hope that bound them together. And so, with the fate of two worlds hanging in the balance, he lifted her into his arms and stepped forward into the unknown. Gust held the unconscious woman tightly in his arms, her luminous green skin oddly cool to the touch despite the scorching heat that radiated from the battlefield. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to leave her to complete his mission and ensure his own survival, but something deeper, something primal, kept him rooted in place. She had saved him. If it weren't for her inexplicable power, he would be nothing more than a charred corpse beneath a barrage of enemy fire. He had seen Drur warriors ride through entire squads of highly trained soldiers with ease, had lost comrades to their relentless assault, had watched as their technology and biological enhancements shattered humanity's most advanced defenses. Yet here she was injured, alone, defenseless, and now unconscious in his arms, and she was nothing like the ruthless killers he had spent years fighting. The enemy was still out there, prowling, waiting for the right moment to strike. His helmet display flickered with proximity warnings, highlighting a half-dozen heat signatures moving through the ruined cityscape, circling like vultures. His escape routes were dwindling fast, and he didn't have time to question why this woman, this Dre, had chosen to protect him. His grip tightened around his rifle as he shifted her weight against his chest, his body tensing at the telltale sound of shifting rubble. Somewhere in the distance, they were closing in. The air felt heavier, charged with an almost electric tension, as if the very planet itself held its breath in anticipation of the blood to come. He moved quickly, his boots crunching against the cracked pavement as he darted into the ruins of an old building, its skeletal remains offering little cover but enough concealment to buy him precious seconds. The walls were riddled with scorch marks, the once proud structure now reduced to little more than shattered stone and rusted metal beams that jutted toward the sky like broken fingers. The Dre patrol was meticulous, moving in coordinated sweeps, their keen senses attuned to even the faintest disturbance. Gustav knew their tactics well. They hunted like wolves, using superior agility and speed to flush out their prey. Before delivering the killing blow, he needed a plan. Lowering the woman carefully onto the ground behind a crumbling wall, he checked her vitals with his combat scanner. Her pulse was steady but weak, her breathing shallow. The wound along her side was serious. Without treatment, she wouldn't last long. Her tail twitched, slightly curling instinctively toward her body, as if she were trying to shield herself. Even in unconsciousness, Gustav exhaled sharply, forcing his mind to focus. He had trained for every possible scenario, had memorized survival tactics and battlefield maneuvers, but nothing had prepared him for this. He was a soldier, not a medic, and certainly not someone equipped to deal with an injured enemy, let alone one who might hold the key to something far greater than this war. A flash of movement in his periphery sent his instincts into overdrive. He pressed his back against the wall, gripping his rifle tightly, as a dry warrior prowled past the opening in the ruins, its sharp reptilian gaze sweeping over the area with lethal precision. The hunter's armor gleamed under the dim light, a sleek biomechanical design that merged seamlessly with its scaled body. Unlike the woman, this one was clearly built for combat, its physique lean and powerful, its every movement exuding predatory grace. Gustav barely breathed. The warrior hesitated for a moment, nostrils flaring as if scenting the air for something. Gustav's finger tightened on the trigger, every muscle in his body coiled, ready to strike if necessary. Then, without warning, the Draw's gaze snapped toward the woman's hiding spot. Gustav didn't wait. He surged forward with brutal efficiency, his rifle's muzzle flashing as he fired a short, controlled burst into the enemy center mass. The round struck true, staggering the warrior, but dry physiology was notoriously resilient. One well-placed shot was never enough. The enemy recovered faster than expected, letting out a guttural snarl as it lunged at him, with razor-sharp claws extending from its gauntlets. Gustav barely managed to twist out of the way, feeling the wind of the strike brush past his helmet as he drove the butt of his rifle into the creature's throat, buying himself a fraction of a second. The warrior stumbled, but only for a moment, and Gustav knew he had mere seconds before it retaliated. He needed to end this fast. Pivoting on his heel, he grabbed his combat knife from his belt and drove it deep into the Draw's exposed side, twisting viciously. The alien let out a strangled hiss, its body convulsing as its vital organs were shredded by the serrated blade. Gustav withdrew the knife and let the warrior collapse in a heap, its lifeblood pooling beneath it in dark rivulets that shimmered eerily in the dim light. The sound of distant shouting snapped him back to reality. He had seconds, maybe less, before the rest of the patrol realized something was wrong. Wiping the blood from his knife, he turned back toward the woman, who remained motionless where he had left her. He wasn't sure why he cared whether she lived or died. By all rights, he should have left her there to her fate, yet something about her, about the way she had looked at him before she lost consciousness, made it impossible for him to walk away. Scooping her up once more, he adjusted his grip and moved swiftly through the ruin winds, his mind racing with possible escape routes. The settlement's outskirts led to a canyon system, a treacherous maze of jagged cliffs and hidden tunnels that could provide cover. If he could make it there, he might have a chance of losing his pursuers, but time was against him as he reached the outer edge of the ruins. His calm unit flared to life once more, this time with a heavily encrypted signal, a priority transmission from high command. He hesitated before answering, his gut telling him that whatever came next would only complicate things further. Valkyrin report. The voice was clipped, authoritative. His commanding officer, General Evers, never wasted time on pleasantries. We lost contact with your squad. Status. Gusta hesitated. Technically, he should have been dead like the rest of them. And if he revealed that he was currently harboring a dry one with unknown abilities, his orders would be clear: terminate or detain. Neither option sat well with him. Squad's gone, he said, finally keeping his voice neutral. Ambush. I barely made it out. A pause. Understood. We're pulling back forces from Zos 9. The war effort's shifting elsewhere. You've got 24 hours to extract. Do not engage unless necessary. The transmission cut out before he could respond. He clenched his jaw, his frustration mounting. He was being abandoned. The entire planet was being written off as a lost cause. That meant no reinforcements, no evac, no Back up he was on his own. And now so was she. Gustav exhaled slowly, his gaze flickering down to the woman in his arms. Whatever secret she carried, whatever power lay dormant within her, it had just become his responsibility. He had 24 hours to figure out what the hell he was going to do next. With the enemy closing in and time slipping through his fingers, he tightened his hold on her and pressed forward toward the canyons, toward the unknown, toward a future that had just become infinitely more dangerous. The weight of the unconscious dry woman in his arms grew heavier with every step Gustav took through the treacherous ruins of Zos9. The crumbling infrastructure of the abandoned settlement stretched around him, its shattered remains whispering the tales of battles long lost to the tides of war. The twin moon above cast a dim, eerie glow over the wreckage, their cold light contrasting the simmering heat still rising from the scorched ground. Every breath Gustav took was laced with the acrid sting of burning metal, and every movement sent a dull ache through his battered body. The battle had taken its toll, leaving him drained and dangerously low on supplies. Yet none of that mattered now. The only thing keeping him moving was the knowledge that he was being hunted. The Drur patrol troll that had nearly caught them was still out there searching for their fallen comrade, and the woman he carried. He had killed one of their own, silent and efficient, just as he had been trained, but the rest wouldn't give up so easily. Dry warriors were relentless, their code demanding vengeance for slain brethren. If they found him, they wouldn't hesitate to gut him where he stood, and they would take her with them. What they would do to her, he couldn't be sure, but something in the way the enemy leader had snarled her name early had told him everything he needed to know. Nalani, they had called her that before trying to blast her into oblivion. He didn't know what it meant, but judging by their ruthlessness, they'd wanted her dead just as much as they wanted him. His boots crunched against the cracked pavement as he pressed on, weaving through the desolate ruins toward the jagged cliffs of the canyon system beyond. The terrain ahead was rough, treacherous, and full of unpredictable dangers, but it was also his best chance at evading pursuit. The Dre were strong, fast, and lethal in open combat, but they weren't built for prolonged chases through unstable environments. The human military had studied them long enough to learn their weaknesses. Gustav just had to make it to the canyons before they caught his scent. He risked a glance down at the woman in his arms. Nalani, if that was truly her name, remained unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. The wound along her side still oozed teal-hued blood. Stark against her luminous green skin, her long tail twitched slightly as if reacting to the pain, even in her unconscious state, and her brow furrowed in some distant troubled dream. He didn't know why, but the sight of her like this made his gut twist in a way that had nothing to do with the mission or survival. Something about her unsettled him, though he couldn't yet put a name to it. Perhaps it was because she had saved him when she hadn't needed to, or maybe it was the way she had looked at him before she collapsed, her gaze filled with something deeper than fear, something ancient, something knowing. He shook his head, forcing himself to focus. Emotions were dangerous. They clouded judgment, led to mistakes, and in war mistakes meant death. He had spent years stripping himself of such vulnerabilities, forging himself into a weapon sharp enough to carve through the chaos of battle. And yet here he was carrying an injured enemy through hostile territory like some damn hero from an old war epic. He needed to get his head straight before it got him killed. The terrain shifted beneath his feet as he finally reached the canyon's edge, a sheer drop looming just ahead. The jagged cliffs yawned into an abyss of darkness, the winding paths below barely visible in the dim light. It was a perilous descent, the kind of terrain that could snap a man's ankle in an instant or send him plummeting to his death if he lost his footing. But Gustav had little choice. He adjusted Nalani's weight against his chest, bracing himself as he began the treacherous climb. Downward, the air grew colder the deeper he went, the canyon walls pressing in around him like silent sentinels of ancient stone. Shadows flickered across the uneven surfaces, creating the illusion of movement where there was none, keeping his nerves on edge. Every now and then a rock would dislodge beneath his boots, tumbling into the abyss below with a sound that echoed ominously through the ravine. His grip tightened on Nani, his muscles straining against the added burden of her weight as he navigated the descent. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, each one filled with the ever-present threat of pursuit. But as he finally reached the canyon floor, the overwhelming silence and a different kind of unease crawling down his spine. There were no sounds of nature, no shifting winds, no distant howls of predators that usually lurked in the depths of planets like these. Only silence, vast and empty, as if the canyon itself was holding its breath. Gustav exhaled sharply, adjusting Nalani in his arms. As he pressed forward, he needed to find shelter somewhere defensible where he could treat her wounds and regroup. His supplies were running low, but he still had enough fielded medical gear to stop the bleeding and stabilize her, at least for now. He moved quickly, scanning the walls for any sign of a natural alcove or cave system where they could hide. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spotted a narrow crevice in the rock face, just wide enough to squeeze through. It was a tight fit, but inside the space widened into a shallow cavern, its walls smooth and untouched by the devastation that had consumed the world above. He lowered Nalani carefully onto the ground, his own limbs aching from the strain of carrying her for so long. For the first time since the ambush, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. He pulled off his helmet, running a gloved hand through his sweat-dampened hair before turning his attention to the woman before him. Her condition hadn't worsened, but was still dangerously weak. He pulled out his medkit, quickly disinfecting the wound along her side before applying a temporary sealant. The gel-like substance adhered to her skin immediately, its advanced formula designed to stop bleeding and promote rapid healing. As he worked, he couldn't help but study her features. She was undeniably alien, yet there was something hauntingly human in the softness of her face, in the way her brow furrowed slightly even in unconsciousness. Her luminous green skin shimmered faintly in the dim light, and her hair, dark and silken, cascaded around her like liquid night. She was beautiful in a way that defied logic, a contradiction of strength and fragility wrapped in an enigma that he didn't have time to unravel. As he secured the last of the bandages, her breathing shifted, her body stirring ever so slightly. Then, with a soft, pained murmur, her eyes fluttered open. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, unspoken tension crackling in the space between them. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "You saved me." Gustav's jaw clenched, his own voice rougher than he intended when he finally responded, "Yeah, looks like we're even." But he knew deep down that nothing about this was simple. He hadn't just saved an enemy, he had saved someone who carried a secret powerful enough to change the fate of an entire war. And whether he liked it or not, their fates were now bound together, entwined in ways he was only beginning to understand. Nalani's eyes were pools of liquid gold, glowing faintly even in the dim cavern light, her gaze fixed on Gustav with something he couldn't quite decipher: curiosity, caution, and perhaps something deeper lurking beneath the surface. As she stirred, shifting slightly against the cold rock beneath her, a flicker of pain crossed her features, and instinctively her tail curled closer around her body, a protective gesture that did not go unnoticed. Gust had seen many things on the battlefield, had fought countless creatures, some humanoid, others monstrous, but none had captivated his attention quite like her. She was unlike any Drur he had encountered. She lacked the brutal, imposing armor, the feral aggression, the unwavering hatred that radiated from her kind when they fought against humanity's forces. There was something else about her, something that set her apart, and for the first time since the ambush, he found himself desperate for answers. He watched as she slowly became aware of her surroundings, her breathing quickening slightly as realization dawned. Her gaze darted from the jagged walls of the cavern to the narrow entrance, and then finally back to him. She did not immediately recoil or lash out as he had expected. Instead, she simply studied him, her expression unreadable, as if she were attempting to make sense of his presence. Then, with great effort, she pushed herself up onto one elbow, her movements sluggish but determined. Gustav knew she was still weak, her body exhausted from whatever energy she had used to summon that impossible barrier that had shielded them both. Whatever she had done back there wasn't normal, not even by Drur standards. "You saved me," she said again, this time stronger, though her voice was laced with exhaustion. Her accent was subtle but distinct, the syllables carrying an almost melodic cadence that contrasted sharply with the harsh clipped tones of his own language. Gustav exhaled sharply, shifting his weight. Where he crouched beside her. Seems that way, he replied, his tone deliberately neutral. He didn't want to admit that saving her had been instinctual, that in that split second he had chosen to throw himself between her and the enemy without thinking about why. He also didn't want to admit that he hadn't abandoned her afterward, even when every tactical protocol screamed at him to leave her behind. Now Milani's golden eyes narrowed slightly, as if she could hear the unspoken thoughts running through his mind. You could have left me. You should have. Gustav shrugged, not quite willing to dissect his own motivations. You saved me first. I figured